Hi everyone, this is Anton, and in today's video I'm going to show you how to add a Prisma ORM into a NestJS application. What is the first step to do in order to add the Prisma into a NestJS application is to create one. I mean, to create a NestJS application. How to do that we are going to check out on their official documentation. The first command that they suggest us to run is this one. So in the new terminal, clearing this up, we are going to run this command, which will install the NestJS CLI onto your system, or if you have already had it installed, it will just update it to the latest version. Alright, so now we are ready to create a new project. Let me quickly change to my local directory. Nest new NestJS Prisma MongoDB demo. This is how our project is going to be called. We are choosing npm because I always use npm instead of yarn. I don't see any valid reasons now in 2022 to use npm, to use yarn over npm. If you know any of such reasons, please write down in the comments. And yeah, as you have already noticed, we are going to use MongoDB as a target database because it is just faster to get started with it. Now our application has been created. Now let's switch to the directory of the application, and from here I'm going to open my IDE, Visual Studio Code. We are not going to need this window anymore. Alright, so we have a bunch of initial files created for us. We can just commit them to the Git repository. Well, alright, so now we can switch to installing the Prisma into our application. On their official website, let's just use their guides. We want to add it to an existing project. We will choose MongoDB here. So what is the next step? First thing first, they suggest us to install Prisma dependency as a dev dependency. So let's do this in the terminal. It was pretty quick to install. Well, now they say that we can now refer to Prisma just like that, npx Prisma. This command will just render for us some prompt. Well, so now they want us to initialize a Prisma project. Prisma int. So what has happened now? The two main files have been generated. The first one is the schema, where we will define our database models, and the .env file, where we will want to set our database URL, for example. But let's first continue with the manual. Connect your database. Right. Yeah. First of all, they suggest us in our schema file to specify MongoDB as a provider instead of the default Postgre. Next, they suggest us to specify our actual database connection stream into our .env file. I have mine here prepared. Please don't try to connect to my database, since I will delete this user before this video gets published. Yeah, and of course what we want to do is to ignore our .env file Yeah, it has been ignored. Okay, so what else should we do? It looks like this step is, we are done with this step. Next, introspection. Well, basically on this page about introspection, they suggest us to create some data, a database, some collections, and probably to add some data to our database, and then in this base to generate the Prisma model. But I usually don't work this way. I believe that this work starts from code, not from the database, especially from MongoDB. So we will just skip this step. We will just as a reference leave this tab open, so we will switch to the further step in a new tab, installing the Prisma client. Well, the next dependency that we should install already as a production dependency is Prisma client. This is actually what our NestJS code will eventually interact with in order to work with database. Well, all right. The next steps querying the database and whatever there is next is not going to be so relevant for us, for NestJS particularly. First of all, I suggest to commit these changes for now. All right, and to integrate it actually with our NestJS application, we can use the guide from the NestJS official website, Prisma. Here they describe some steps that we have already passed here. What is important for us now here, because everything this we made, or for example migrations we don't need. So what is important is the last step, the Prisma service, to create a Prisma service. I would suggest to create the service within a module, within an NestJS module. For this, we will just generate some code, nest generator source Prisma, no space, because we will definitely not want to write any test on the Prisma service. Let it be just REST API. We will not want any endpoints. Some packages, additional packages have been installed. So what we have in our application appeared, the Prisma module. We will definitely not want controller here, so we will just delete it and remove it from here. Instead, what we will want in this module is to export the Prisma service. Now, and the service itself, the code from it, we just copy from here and paste into our service. Currently we should commit those changes. Alright, so here on this step, actually the integration of Prisma into an NestJS application is over. So from now what we will focus on is on using it. I mean, how to use it. In order to use the Prisma API on some practical example, let's just try to create some basic backend for a to-do application. We will start from generating another module, which is to-do module, resource to-do. It will of course be the REST API, and here we don't mind to generate some endpoints for us. This time we will leave this file, the test files, because we would potentially want to cover this to-do logic with tests. Well, alright, so the first thing what we would want our application to do is to create a new to-do item in our database via this endpoint, which is post to-do. In order to be able already to test it, let's just create the definition of this endpoint in our REST client. I'm using Insomnia in this case. To do, we will want post. Our website is going to be hosted on port 3000 by default. Typically, you would want to configure this for your production application, but within this video, that's fine. Well, okay, so now let's try it. Of course, we didn't launch the application, so let's do this. For this, we must run this the ugliest command npm run start dev in order to run our application in development or watch mode. Alright, there is some error. It says that we have not initialized Prisma generate. Let's do this, but we must do this with npx Prisma generate. Alright, another error. It says that we don't have any models in our schema file. So, well, that's not a problem, since we are going to create a to-do application. Let's define a model for a to-do item. The model is going to have an identifier, the label of what are we going to do, and the status, if it is done or not. The status, we know that it is going to be boolean, label is going to be string. About ID, we can just reuse this tab that we remained opened to map the /ID internal database property into normal ID one and mark it as object ID. Another thing is that we will want to specify as a default false the done property, because all the new properties are supposed to be not done. Otherwise, there wouldn't be any sense for the application overall. Now let's run the Prisma generate again. Okay, this time everything is fine, looks like, and yeah, our development server doesn't complain anymore. Let's take a look at our endpoint, and yeah, everything is fine within the current code that it has been generated for us. Let's take a look at service. Yeah, this is what the service returns. Let's quickly commit those changes. Okay, great. So what we want to do now is to actually make a request to our database in order to create actually a to-do. In the controller, we are not going to need to change anything. Instead, we will need to change it in the service. Well, first of all, let's quickly inject a dependency of Prisma service that we have previously defined into our to-do service. Prisma service. Now our development server complains because we have not imported the Prisma module into our to-do module. Okay, Now everything is fine. And in the service, in order to create a to-do, we will just call the Prisma service, our to-do model, and the method create. It will want the arguments data, and we are going to create a new to-do item on the base of the create to-do DTO, which currently looks like this, empty class, and which doesn't make happy our create method. It has some type checks. Well, what actually it means for us, that it requires create to-do DTO to have all the required properties of the to-do model, So what are the required properties? It is only the label, because ID is supposed to be auto-generated on create operation, and done we marked as default false, so only label. What could we do is in our create to-do entity just to add a property label. Well, okay, as we can see, it does not complain anymore. However, usually it is not done like that, so let's do everything correctly since the first place. Because the create to-do DTO is usually based on the to-do entity. Our entity looks like this, also empty class. By the way, I don't like anything to be called just like our module, so in order to specify it, that this is the entity, we will just write entity. In order to make it, well, what we want to do with this entity is to make it identical within this task to our model in the database. To leverage some type check-ins, let me close up some of the things here. In order to leverage type check-ins, we can make it implement the to-do model. And as we have already defined that we don't want anything to be called just like the module, so we will just rename it to a to-do model. Now we want to imitate the properties, I would say. The ID, there is ID string, there is label string, and done boolean. Now it is fine. So for now we are ready to proceed with our to-do DTO. What we should do is to extend this class with the entity class, but not with the entire class, but just with the required properties. For this, we are going to leverage the NestJS theme, which is omit type. We are going to omit from the entity some properties that we are enumerating in this array. We are omitting the ID and done. All right. Yeah, let's not bother too much about code formatting from now. Yeah. As we can see in our service, it doesn't complain anymore, so it is happy with our type check-ins. Actually, there also would typically want to add some some data validation here, making this required and to be string, but we will omit this for this video, and instead we will just follow, we will just test against the correct data, aka happy path. So let's just in our JSON body of the request define our future body, which is in fact the create to do DTO. Well, the first thing that we would want to add is to do is create a NestJS app. All right, let's run this request. Right, so currently we see that something has been returned. We can suppose that this is a new record that has just been added to our database. Let's check this out in our Atlas database, and yeah, it looks like this is the same record. It means that we have successfully created the creation of a DTO, of a to-do thing, I'm sorry. One word that I would like to say more, that keep in mind that this is an asynchronous method, so I will just as a reference add the async awaiting here. The same would be valid for the controller as well, but in this case it would work without async await, just like here. I'm just adding it as a reference, just like I have said before. And this is when we are ready to make a commit. Post to do. Well, and finally, when we creating something in the database, we would usually to read this at some point. So let's implement another endpoint, get to do, where we would want to display all the to-dos from our database. We can just reuse this URL. Currently it is not what we want. In the controller here is this endpoint, so where we will work is here under find all method. Well, actually this is pretty easy. We will invoke this Prisma service to do and the method find many without any arguments. Let's run this request once again. Okay, we have an array only with one to-do so far, so let's just test it some more time. The second thing, for example, we would want to do is to add Prisma. Okay, and the third step, implement endpoints, for example. Okay, so what we now have in our get to do, we now have the 3 steps that we have just created. Let's verify if it is true, if they are in our database actually. And yeah, it is, they are, I mean. Well, so let's quickly commit this endpoint, the get to do endpoint, I mean its implementation. And that's basically it about how to install Prisma ORM with into a NestJS application and some basic usage of it. So like this video up if it has been useful for you, subscribe to the channel if you don't want to miss future videos with this kind, and or yeah, write some comments if you want to say something, and don't stop coding, don't stop growing.